Welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 of Epic History TV's American Presidents. If you didn't see the first episode, there's a link in the description. You can see my reaction to that one. Now we're ready to dive into part 2. Just going to watch, see what he has to say, and just offer my thoughts about each of the presidents he talks about.
Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of 9th President William Henry Harrison. His presidency saw federal peacetime spending pass $1 billion for the first time. He also passed laws to ensure fairer competition in business.
So that's another Ohio-born Republican president. He represents Indiana because he was elected to government in Indiana, but he's actually from Ohio. His father, John Scott Harrison, interesting history there. If you ever want to look it up, you should do a Google search and check out the history of what happened to John Scott Harrison after he died. Some body snatchers took his body and they ended up finding him hanging from like a meat hook or something. So he was the son, John Scott Harrison was, of President William Henry Harrison.
Grover Cleveland. His second term was overshadowed by economic depression. The president offered little federal assistance and sent in troops to break a strike by the American Railway Union. William McKinley raised import tariffs to unprecedented heights to protect U.S. industry and waged war against Spain over Cuban independence. As a result, America gained the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Shortly into his second term, he was assassinated by a Polish-American anarchist, Leo Czolgosz.
So let's talk a little bit about William McKinley, probably one of the more pro-business presidents we've ever had. Also, probably one of the most religious men who's ever been president. Very deep conviction when it comes to his religious faith. We've had a lot of religious presidents, but McKinley was born in Niles, Ohio, which is my wife's hometown. And a great uncle of mine actually built the house that William McKinley was born in, right down there on Main Street in Niles. And they've built a replica of that now. But William McKinley... he's the governor of Ohio. He was a congressman who was very much about tariffs even as a congressman. And, of course, the last Civil War veteran to ever serve as president. He was in the 23rd Ohio, which was at one time commanded by Rutherford B. Hayes. So two presidents in the same regiment. McKinley was a quartermaster sergeant or a orderly sergeant, something like that. But then he eventually rises to become an officer. He was at the Battle of Antietam, didn't fight, but was at the Battle of Antietam. There's a huge monument that was built after his assassination. But of course, he chooses Teddy Roosevelt as a president who was very different than him as his vice president. And then, of course, when McKinley died after about a week after being wounded by Leon Czolgosz, Roosevelt becomes president and goes in a very different direction with the Republican Party.
Theodore Roosevelt. At 42, the youngest ever president.
Lincoln, wow.
As vigorous and energetic in office as he was in life, he broke up business monopolies, asserted U.S. power abroad, ensured completion of the Panama Canal, passed laws to protect national forests and parks, and won a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering a truce between Russia and Japan.
And he's a distant cousin to Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, his niece is Eleanor Roosevelt, who married Franklin. Franklin was married Eleanor, who was a Roosevelt before she was married. Her father was Teddy's brother, and there's actually a photo of Lincoln's funeral going down through the streets of New York City. And you can actually see in the window Theodore Roosevelt and his brother, who I think it was Kermit. I can't remember, Elliot maybe. I think it was Elliot. But it was Eleanor's father. The two of them are in the window watching Lincoln's funeral procession go down. But I highly recommend Ken Burns' series on the Roosevelts, on Teddy Roosevelt, Eleanor, FDR. Fantastic documentary if you want to learn more.
William Howard Taft. A distinguished judge, but not a natural politician. He achieved
Republican.
Many reforms, but alienated progressive Republicans, including his former friend and ally, Theodore Roosevelt, who went off to form the Bull Moose Party. The Republican split handed the 1912 election to the Democrats.
So William Howard Taft is TR, Teddy Roosevelt's, he hated being called Teddy, so Theodore, or TR, was TR's hand-picked successor when he left office. He could have run again, but he chose not to. But he didn't. Teddy Roosevelt didn't like the direction that Taft goes with the presidency, and so he challenges him for the Republican nomination, but Taft gets the nomination, and so then Teddy decides to go off and form his own party, the Bull Moose Party, runs against Taft, splits the Republican vote, and allows for Woodrow Wilson to become president. Incidentally, you should also look up what happened when Teddy Roosevelt was shot while giving a speech. Probably the toughest SOB that's ever been president, just even in his early life, just some of the stuff he did out west on his own. But he gets shot in the chest. His speech was so thick that it actually slowed the bullet down. But he finishes the speech before he goes to get treatment.
Taft later became Chief Justice of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, a former professor of political science and the first Southern president since the Civil War. He passed progressive reforms at home, and after numerous German provocations, led America into World War I. His vision for a new world order, with America playing a full part as a member of the new League of Nations, was blocked by a Republican Senate.
So, Woodrow Wilson, born in Virginia, one of his earliest memories is of seeing Jefferson Davis as he fled from Richmond after the fall of Richmond, coming through his town in Virginia. I want to say it was Lynchburg, but I could be wrong about that. On his way to fleeing toward Georgia, where he was eventually captured. Woodrow Wilson's a Southerner, but he eventually becomes the president of Princeton University. Probably for the last couple of years of Woodrow Wilson's second term, he was not running the country. His wife, his second wife actually, he had probably had a bad stroke, and his wife basically kept everyone from seeing him. Probably was signing bills on his behalf, kind of ran the country almost. So you could almost say she was the first woman president because she was making decisions for him. Of course, it was during Wilson's administration that women were first given the right to vote, so that's a big deal. And that might be why the high ranking, but I'm not a fan of Woodrow Wilson at all, and I would not rank him that high.
Warren G. Harding. He sought to roll back Wilson's wartime measures, but following his sudden death from natural causes, revelations emerged of extramarital affairs and cabinet corruption that destroyed his reputation.
Had a child in one of those affairs.
Calvin Coolidge.
So let's talk about Warren Harding. Probably the reason we haven't had a Republican or Ohio president since. Harding was terrible. He was absolutely awful. One of our worst presidents. A lot of scandals, a lot of issues going on there. Dies of a heart attack while on a trip to California. I think he was with his mistress at the time. Just in the past couple of years, they found out that he had a child, like, you know, they call him a love child, with one of his mistresses, and they did some DNA to confirm that. He ran a newspaper before he was president. I think he was also a senator. I think he was elected from the Senate to the office of president. We haven't had many senators elected president, at least not directly from the Senate to the presidency.
The son of a village storekeeper, moral conservative, and man of famously few words. He also believed in minimal federal intervention, and is still held up as a role model by fans of small government.
So they have him from Massachusetts, and I think he might have been the governor of Massachusetts. But he's actually buried in Vermont. I had a chance to visit his grave in Vermont on a hillside, beautiful location, nice big flat stone, really nice. And I'm a big fan of Calvin Coolidge. I think he was a very principled person, and he operated the country that way. He just was not somebody who really felt like the government should do a lot. I'd probably have him a little higher than that, maybe around 20th or so.
Herbert Hoover. Raised a Quaker, he was a successful engineer, humanitarian, and Secretary of Commerce. But his presidency was overshadowed by the Great Depression. Attempts to revive the economy included spending on major public works, but to little effect.
I think Hoover was probably one of the smartest people who's ever been president. And of course, anything he did during his presidency was going to be overshadowed by what happened in 1929 with the stock market crash, with the entrance into the Depression. He had been Secretary of Commerce under Coolidge. Was very, very good in that role. Brilliant mind when it came to economics and things like that. And so it's kind of ironic then that he mastermind. Well, I shouldn't say masterminds. I don't think it would have mattered who was president at that point. But he actually lived into the 60s. I think he died in the mid 60s. And I want to say he was the first president born west of the Mississippi, but I could be wrong about that.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, diagnosed with polio, aged 39. His package of economic measures helped lift America out of the Great Depression.
I'm going to stop right there because I know that a lot of people say that, but I'm going to strongly disagree that his New Deal policies are the reason we got out of the Depression. The reason we got out of the Depression was this little thing called World War II. It was the economic mobilization for war. That's obviously something that can be debated, but I strongly disagree with the assertion that Roosevelt brought us out of the Depression. I give him high marks for his leadership during World War II, but for that reason, I would not put him probably higher than maybe fifth.
While also improving federal treatment of Native Americans, winning an unprecedented 4 elections. He led America to the verge of victory in World War II, dying in office just 3 weeks before Germany's surrender. Harry S. Truman, seeking a swift end to the Pacific War, he authorized the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan. At home, he passed progressive welfare and employment reform and prioritized civil rights. Abroad, he provided international leadership as the West entered a Cold War with the Soviet Union.
So he's a pretty mild-mannered guy. He is only selected as vice president during FDR's last term. He hadn't been vice president before that. And he really didn't have that much of a relationship with FDR. But one of my favorite stories about Roosevelt, or about Truman, is his interaction with Eleanor Roosevelt when he comes to the White House after they find out that President Roosevelt has died down in Warm Springs, Georgia. And he shows up at the White House and he says, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "No, is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." What a time to have come into office right at the end of World War II, having to make this decision about an atomic bomb he didn't even know existed before that as vice president, kind of coming out of relative obscurity politically, even though he'd been a senator. He had been an officer during World War I. I think he was I want to say an artillery captain from Missouri. A lot of issues with possible involvement with corrupt politician type things going on in Missouri, but I highly recommend Gary Sinise playing him in the movie. I think it might have been a mini-series, but check it out. It's worth your while if you want to learn more about Harry Truman.
Dwight D. Eisenhower,
very good president,
Supreme Allied Commander in Europe in World War II. He was approached by both parties to run for president. He was the first to be limited to 2 terms by a new constitutional amendment. He sought to contain the Soviet Union and de-escalate the Cold War, and oversaw a period of great American prosperity that included the construction of the U.S. interstate highway system.
So Eisenhower, obviously another one of those wartime generals who gets ushered into office by popularity. And, of course, he comes in after Truman, only Republican president in a period of about 30 years there. Excellent president, very good leader. I think both sides would agree on that. I'd put him around 10th. A lot of good domestic policies after a time of great conflict with 2 wars, with World War II and then the Korean conflict. And he's kind of right in between World War II, Korea, and then Vietnam, which comes in the 60s.
John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president, and at 43, the youngest elected to office. He sought to instill America with renewed idealism, made some progress over civil rights in the South, and narrowly avoided nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, by Lee Harvey Oswald.
I think could have been one of our all-time greats had he had a chance to live long enough to see it. I'd put him probably around where he is there, 11th. Fantastic leadership in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I love his challenge to America to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. I think we missed that kind of bold leadership and that kind of goal setting. I wish we had more of that. Presidents used to do more of that, but the kind of thing we needed at an important time in our history. A young man, a World War II veteran. His older brother, of course, had died during World War II. His father had been an ambassador that had to be removed because he was a little too pro-Germany as the ambassador to the UK. But I think Kennedy could have been one of the top 5 presidents had he had a chance to live, but we'll never know.
Lyndon B. Johnson. He enacted a wide-ranging package of reforms to address racial injustice and poverty. But frustration at the speed of progress was reflected by race riots in America's cities. Overseas, he continued to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
So Johnson, he's chosen as a Texas Democrat. I think he was the Senate minority leader or majority leader. I can't remember which, if they were in power at the time. But he was the Democrats' leader in the Senate. Chosen to balance the ticket with this Northeastern Kennedy and the Southern Johnson to kind of bring in the Southern Democrats. Very different from Kennedy. Very different leadership style. Very different personality. Definitely a racist. And yet signed some of the most important race legislation in our country's history. So a really interesting kind of dynamic there. I really don't know how I feel about Lyndon Johnson. My gut tells me not to like him, but I also see that he did some good things. But I don't think I'd put him as high as 16th. I'd probably put him in the mid-20s, personally.
Richard Nixon withdrew U.S. troops from Vietnam and reduced tension with the Soviet Union and China. He became the first president to resign his office to avoid impeachment for his role in the Watergate scandal.
So again, here's a president who is remembered because of how his second term ended, which was with his resignation with the Watergate scandal. Previous to that, his vice president had also resigned, Spiro Agnew, over some tax issues. And so he had to appoint a new vice president, and he chooses the House Minority Leader, who then becomes president out of nowhere. But I think Nixon could have been ranked a lot higher if it had not been for what happened at the end. But you have to take that into consideration. Fantastic on foreign policy. Did some really good things. Had been Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. Probably won the election against Kennedy, but we'll never know for sure. There's definitely some funny stuff that was going on there, but a really super close election against Kennedy. Had to wait 8 years before he got his chance.
Gerald Ford granted Nixon a presidential pardon, then struggled with inflation and economic recession at home, while furthering détente with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd rank him that high, but he was only president for a couple of years, wasn't never elected himself to vice president or president. He had, I think, played football for the University of Michigan, from Grand Rapids, Michigan there, and I don't think we have enough tape on him, so to speak, to really have a fair assessment of the kind of president he was.
Carter. He struggled with an energy supply crisis, inflation, and unemployment. Raised a Baptist, he championed human rights abroad, brokered peace between Egypt and Israel, and negotiated a treaty giving control of the Panama Canal to Panama. But his popularity was greatly damaged by the Iran hostage crisis.
So personally, I'd probably drop Carter to maybe 36, 37. I think, in my own opinion, worst president of my lifetime. But it gets really difficult when you start getting to these more modern presidents, because I don't think you can give a fair assessment of people like Trump, Obama, or even Bush for another generation or two. You got to wait and see. Because some people who leave office very popular, as time goes on, you think less of what they did, and vice versa. I don't think any of these more modern presidents are going to be really judged all that fairly.
Ronald Reagan, former Hollywood actor, and at 69, the oldest
I think
elected
I'd put him
president.
a little higher than that.
His tax cuts
Closer to
and
the top
free
10.
market reforms were credited with revitalizing the U.S. economy. He launched America's war on drugs, began an arms race with the Soviet Union, which he described as the evil empire, and supported anti-communist insurgencies around the world.
I think there's a lot more you could say about him. Personally, I think best president of my lifetime, but I'd probably put him a little higher than 18th. They called him the Great Communicator for a reason. Fantastic. He'd been an actor. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, had been a Democrat, but then switches to become a Republican, gets elected governor of California, almost wins the nomination in 76 against Gerald Ford, and then does win the nomination in 1980. Against, among others, George H.W. Bush, who he makes his vice president. Boy, some of the most memorable presidential speeches of my life were given by Reagan. Of course, his Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall, or this wall. The speech that he gave as a kid, having watched the Challenger explode in 1986. A lot of people watched that live at school. And then to come home that night and listen to the president. I just remember vividly that speech that he gave. And he even took time to speak to the American children during that speech. And I just think some of those things just really, in my mind, make him a very memorable and a very important leader in my generation.
George Bush, a decorated World War II Navy pilot, later director of the CIA. He oversaw America's response to the collapse of the Soviet Union and sent American troops to liberate Kuwait during the First Gulf War.
So it's interesting that some of the most consequential elections in our history have been situations where there were more than two people running. Abraham Lincoln only won the presidency in 1860 because the Democrats split their ticket between a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat, allowing Lincoln to win with something like 39 or 40% of the vote. It happens again when Woodrow Wilson gets elected because the Republicans kind of split their vote between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And it happens again in 1992 when George H.W. Bush is running for re-election and Ross Perot runs and ends up getting close to 20% of the vote. And if Perot hadn't dropped out and then re-entered the race, he might have had a chance to win. But he siphoned just enough votes off of George H.W. Bush to allow Bill Clinton to come in and win.
Bill Clinton. His presidency saw a period of peace and prosperity, low unemployment, and falling crime.
15, 16.
He became the second president to be impeached following the Monica Lewinsky scandal, but was found not guilty by the Senate. George W. Bush. Son of George Bush,
I don't think you can
his
rank
presidency
him fairly yet.
was shaped by the 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York and Washington. America's subsequent war on terror led the U.S. to become embroiled in long, costly operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Barack Obama,
Again,
the first African-American president. He passed an economic stimulus package to soften the impact of the 2008 financial crash, and an Affordable Care Act to improve access to medical insurance. American forces continue to have a presence in Afghanistan and Iraq, where they help to tackle the new threat of ISIS.
So I think there's definitely a liberal bent to these rankings, and that's fair. Everybody's going to have their biases. I get that. I don't think I'd have Obama that high. I definitely wouldn't have George W. Bush that low, but I don't think either one of them can be judged fairly for at least another 15, 20 years. I don't think I would have put FDR as high as he did in these rankings. I would have put Lincoln higher. Probably would have changed a few other things, but for the most part, I can't argue with his rankings all that much. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Use that comment section below. Tell me what you think about the rankings. Who would you rank where and why? What do you think about the presidents that we covered in this episode? And do you have any suggestions about other reaction videos you'd like to see me do? You can use the comment section for that, or head on over to the Discord and you can let us know on the Vlogging Through History channel on my Discord server. And the last thing is, if you want to have a little bit more say in the kinds of things that I do videos about, whether it's reaction videos or other types of videos, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Click on the link in the description and you can see the rewards that are available, including ones that allow you to have requests about what kind of videos I make. Thanks for watching.